So we were born and raised in Minnesota, grew up in the Como Park area of St. Paul. We have a really large family. We have 10 siblings. And, for us, we grew up in a different way. We were homeschooled. And so for most of us, we didn't have the opportunities of interacting with neighbors and friends in the same way that some of our peers did. But the way we grew up really, really caused us to draw together. And so we are a really tight-knit group.
Mm-hmm. Really shaped our relationships and what they are today. When you grow up with really only having your siblings around as friends, they really become your best friends. And I think we're still pretty much best friends today.
Yeah.
Spend most holidays together and just
A lot of fun, a lot of
really
laughter.
Really enjoy being close still.
We grew up in an evangelical setting. We were devout Christians according to our own belief system, and we were unaffiliated with any other churches. So most of the churches we attended were just those churches by themselves and had no broader denomination network. Our views were very much towards the end of the world, so we were actively preparing for that. Most of our teachings were around sin in our lives and what we needed to do to correct that sin in preparation for the end of the world. And we were taught as children that the end of the world really was this period of tribulation where Christians who were devout enough, who were good enough, would essentially make it through, and those who were not would unfortunately go to hell. And so that was really the core basis of our teachings as children.
Yeah, I would say that for sure there was an idea too around our religion was the only religion, and though someone else might worship God, love God, in a different church, in a different setting, our evangelical way was the only way, and everyone else was pretty much damned. And we were taught that very young, just very fear-based. If I remember, everything was fear-based. We're fearing the Lord, we're fearing other people, we're fearing other religions.
I remember we referred to ourselves as a God-fearing family. That was something that our parents often would say to us. We are a God-fearing family. And so I don't ever remember any teachings about God as God's amazing and all-encompassing love for us. Instead, it was God as a punisher and God holds you accountable.
God was very scary to me as a child.
So specific examples of fear were really based around punishment and hell. I remember as probably a 4 or 5-year-old child, I would lie awake at night in my bed, sometimes crying because I was worried that that's where I was going. And I had no concept of how to get myself out of that place. So I felt like if I had had a squabble with my sister, if I had been mean to her, those were things that were enough to send me to hell. And if you didn't feel sorry enough for it, if you didn't apologize, those were the things that were sort of counted against you. And bad people, that's where they ended up. That's what our belief was. And so anything that was our parents deemed was not appropriate behavior, was bad behavior, that was something that was counted against you.
Yeah, I felt like it was always kind of like a fight with myself because I wanted to do things like watch Disney movies, which were not allowed in our house because of witchcraft and talking animals and things like that. So it was always this battle. Like I really wanted to be a part of the normal world and what I thought was normal, but I also knew that would cause me to fall, and then there's that fear again would circle back, hell, damnation, and
the rapture was
the rapture was very. I just always remember not feeling ready. Like I was never going to be ready for the rapture because you had to be almost perfect. And I think we were also told and reminded that there just weren't very many people who were going to be taken in the rapture, and there just weren't a lot of Christians on planet Earth, and that freaked me out too because
you're competing against other people.
This entire world and all these nations, there just aren't a lot of perfect born-again Christians, and that was just really hard to wrap my young mind around.
Yeah. I think at the time though in our childhood, it was normalized enough where we believed that what we believed was just regular beliefs. It didn't we had no context in the way we were raised to contrast that to other belief systems, other Christian denominations. To us, it was relatively normal. And then
And I think
later
we
in life,
didn't. I think we didn't really want to believe other things. I think it was so scary that we just didn't even want to try that.
Yeah.
So.
In particular, for me, the book of Revelations was a book that was taken out of symbolism and allegory and into something that was very real. Like all of these things described in that scripture were things that were going to happen. And as a child, some of these things sound really scary, like the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's frightening. And I remember literally thinking that there were going to be these sort of mythical creatures moving around the earth, and the people who were not good enough, the people who were not Christian enough, would be the people who would die.
So we also had this, apart from church trauma, our childhood trauma, but they kind of mingled together at times. So our parents definitely didn't just teach the Bible, but it was taught in more of an abusive way, more of a threat, and definitely
A control
a control
mechanism
thing,
for our behavior.
and yep, and definitely made the Bible seem these scary stories, this the scary thing that's going to happen to us. It was more of at times it seemed like a punishment almost.
Yes. God always came into the stories as a punisher. After something had happened, something wrong, God always came in to sort of clean it up or to correct behavior. I really just don't recall God being an entity that gives us this sort of unconditional love. That was not something that was part of our theological background. It was really an angry God that gets your behavior in line.
We were told about forgiveness, but from how my parents kind of laid things out to us, for the most part, little sins are forgiven. Big things, there's just no going back on.
And consistency too. So, for example, we might siblings squabble, and like 1 or 2 squabbles, we would have the understanding that, okay, you can forgive and move on. But if you're like fighting with your sibling every day, you're probably not a Christian. You're probably not saved. And for us, salvation was something that, at least for me, I don't know about for you, I didn't really understand salvation when I was 5 or 6 years old in the sense that I do as an adult. I just felt like when I was 5 or 6, you prayed hard enough to God, and if God chooses to save you, then he does. But it's also based on your behavior and who you are as a person, whether God will choose to save you or not. And so there is, again, no concept of God extending this gift to us simply because he wants to, simply because that's the nature of God. It was something you had to earn, and it was not something that was given. It was something that you had to hope that you were good enough in order for God to grant you that salvation. And I think just as a child, I didn't have enough clarity in terms of what I was supposed to be doing. I just thought it meant praying hard enough and God will save you. I didn't understand that there was more to it than that.
My relationship was very uncertain, I would say. I never knew if I was good enough for God. I never knew if I was doing the right thing. I felt like I was most of the time, but then I would sin, and then I would feel like, there we go, like it's all over. Even praying to God as a child, I kind of just felt like my prayers were being sent up to nowhere, because when there's so much fear, it's almost this veil that just can't really be lifted. I just couldn't really see God for who he was, apart from someone who's very upset all the time with the bad decisions that I was making, even though I don't really recall most of those bad decisions and what they were, little kid things, stealing candy, something that all children would do. But again, because of that childhood trauma, I wasn't really recognizing the church trauma part of it. It was kind of just all one thing. I was being told I was bad by my parents, and I was also not good enough for God. So,
my relationship with God was fear-based. I recall that when normal childhood things would happen, you'd fall down and skin your knee, or your toy would break or something. To us, we were being told that these were acts of God to correct behavior that was wrong. And so it became really difficult to ever know if what you were doing was good enough because it felt like everything you were doing was wrong and all the time. And because we didn't have this image of God as a protector, as somebody who loved us unconditionally, it was always this sense that God was just waiting for you to screw up. And if you did, there was going to be some sort of punishment. And it was reinforced in our church through their teachings. We would have different lessons where sometimes we'd have guest speakers, or there'd be examples from the Bible where it was articulated in a way that the person's faults, their sin, whatever it is that went wrong, is the cause of whatever happens next. So it was always a very much cause and effect relationship. And again, it was fear-based. It was believing that God was really constantly sort of correcting my behavior as a child. Our faith background was so rigid that we were encouraged to cut off family members who didn't believe the same things as us. And so there was a period of time where we did not spend holidays with our extended family. We didn't see grandparents, we didn't see cousins. And that was because they were of the world, according to our faith teachings. And so we were supposed to just cut them out. We weren't supposed to interact with them. And I remember as kids that was hard because we did have good times with our cousins. We enjoyed hanging out with them. Holidays had always been a lot of fun. In fact, for us, holidays were always a time where we were a little bit more free, and so we could interact more freely with our cousins and with our grandparents. And so to have that taken away, it was really hard. And we didn't understand why. We didn't understand why we couldn't still have that relationship, even if they didn't believe the same things that we did.
Mm-hmm. I think we just had this sense, though, that we were very awkward and just very outside of everybody else's norm. I think we knew that right away. And as far as childhood friends go, the few that we had were involved in the same church, so going through the same kind of church trauma, potentially the same kind of home trauma. Again, just these really big families with very rigid beliefs. And I think that it also made me personally a little bit more judgmental towards other children that I would meet outside of church on those very few occasions, just because I knew, well, you don't think like me, you're not in the same religion, and therefore
Swearing.
You are an enemy.
I remember if another child that we knew outside of our church, like swearing or something like that, like we were just shocked by that, and we thought like they're ungodly, they're unholy.
Yeah, definitely.
Very black and white thinking.
Yeah, I did have some friends outside of church, and again, just felt sad that they didn't want to believe like me because I was just really concerned for their eternity, and I just really wanted them to be able to experience that too, even though I knew it was very scary and not something that I even enjoyed. So it was, again, just this wrestle with myself, you know.
When I turned 12, I recognized that I was different from other people, and I was gay. And at the time, I don't think I ever reconciled being able to say that. It was too difficult because for us, being gay was a very, very damning sin. That is something that would for sure get you into hell. Even if you professed to love God, even if you were saved, it didn't matter. That was the type of offense that there was no going back from. And so it was very, very difficult to recognize that I was different, that I had these feelings, that I was gay without really acknowledging that, and having to grapple with my faith and trying to basically plead and negotiate with God to forgive me for this thing that I had no control over. And as we know, as we move into adulthood, those types of feelings can't be changed. It's part of who you are. And so as a young person, I was really struggling with that, and it was really, really isolating and really hard to reconcile how I felt I was with this expectation I felt God had of me to be different. What shifted for me was when I moved out of the house soon after my 18th birthday. I was really isolated from my parents and even my family to some extent at that point. It was not a good transition. I was sort of banned from the house for a period of time, and I would sneak over sometimes to see my siblings, and we would hang out and stuff, but it was really hard for me to move from what was, you know, comfortable and what I knew from my upbringing to something different in the outside world. And so for me, when I started at the U of M when I was 18 as a freshman, it was a huge culture shift. I didn't have any concept of how to study, how to write papers, how to interact with my peers, because those sort of interactions were never experienced by us growing up. We were, again, very isolated. And so it was really hard. And my first 2 semesters, I really struggled because I was still holding on to the past and I was holding on to my prior religious beliefs. And so I got into this mindset that I needed to defend God to the world. And even though my idea of God at the time was still this God of anger and punishment, it was that if you don't believe that, you're going to go to hell. And so I didn't want other people to go to hell too. And so my worldview was very narrow, it was very judgmental, but it did start to shift the longer I was in school. And that was just from exposure to professors who were doing their best to teach me things and my peers who had different beliefs than I did. And the first 2 semesters when I struggled, I also, as no surprise, I received poor grades. And so for me, it really came to this sort of mental shift of thinking, okay, if I'm going to do this, if I know education is my path forward, I'm going to need to really throw myself into this. And so that's when I started to become more open-minded about my beliefs. I started to pay attention more to what my professors were saying and actually trying to understand and learn from them. And that was really helpful because as I started to learn more about the world around me, I started to realize that my image of God had been really, really restricted. And that maybe God wasn't just this angry, punishing God, but maybe that God could be a God for people beyond just for those of us who had just sinned or whatever. And so that was the shift for me. So again, when I was at the U of M and in school, I didn't have a faith community. I had left home. I did not have any connection with the churches we were raised in. And so I was searching for answers. I was shifting away from this idea that God was angry and punishing me, but I didn't know what God was supposed to be in my life. I didn't understand that. And I'd never had a loving faith community that I could ask these questions openly and feel like I was part of the community. So when I was in school, I found this online community called the Gay Christian Network. And for me, this was the first time I found a community that was just open and accepting and loving from the very beginning. And it was filled with other people, some of them like me who had questions, others who were more established in their faith. Some had been raised much differently in faith communities that loved and accepted them from the very beginning. And to me, that was just mind-blowing. I had never experienced that and I didn't even know it was possible. But what this community provided for me was really a safe space to ask questions, to learn, to be in community. Many of us did not have faith homes at the time, and so there were online forums for prayer requests. There were, some people would even do things on the weekends in terms of sharing devotionals and scripture readings and things. All the things you'd have in a church where these LGBT folks had been rejected from, we were creating this space for ourselves. And this was just before the dawn of social media, and so really, it was just such an astounding moment for me to find this community and such an impactful part of my story when I found them and realized that God could actually love people like me.
So I've had a few shifts in my belief, God going from a fearing God to a loving God that have kind of made up what my faith is today. One of them being in my adolescence, like preteen time, really when my parents kind of walked away from their faith, going from being very religious, very rigid and legalistic to then nothing, kind of gave me the freedom to start thinking for myself. That fear was kind of, there was different fears now, but with both of them kind of disassociating completely, I was left on my own to really get to explore who God is and how I felt about God. I kind of shifted from still being fearful, but also being a little bit angry because I knew that I had a couple of siblings who were gay, who were different, and I knew that just isn't fair because I love them so much, and I didn't want them to die and go to hell, and I didn't want God to be completely out of their reach. I just felt like there could be an in-between, maybe, but I wasn't really sure about that yet. And so another shift happened then later on as an adult, where I was able to start exploring that more. Especially I had kids when I was younger, and I just really wanted them to start out well. I wanted them to have their own faith. I wasn't sure what that was going to be, because I wanted them to choose for themselves. So that led me to start trying to figure out, what does God feel about this, and how does he feel about that person? And it really allowed me to also not be so worried and sad for everybody else, because I realized there's so many religions and everybody worships God in a different way. Some of them are more rigid, but God still loves them for that. And I don't need to think of them as different or even having a different faith in God. If anything, maybe they believe a little bit stronger in things than I do. But really, that though we see God differently, that's what he is. He's loving, and he loves them for who they are and how they worship him. After we had our first two children, my spouse and I we were at a church that what we thought was open and affirming and caring. Come to find out, it definitely was not that. And it actually took the pandemic and us not being able to attend church, and again to have another pause where we can kind of reassess things. And again, it's just taking responsibility for the fact that I love certain parts of this church, but I don't love how they feel about certain subjects, especially when it comes to my siblings being gay, and how they believe that God sees people who are gay. And so it allowed me again to then another shift where we decided, we know that this isn't who God is. And so even though we feel comfortable in this community that we've made, and there are still good people there, we just decided that we have to allow our children to make those decisions with us. The shift in faith also had to do with kind of just letting go of the fear of hell and damnation. I think that was like something that I held really tight to, and not even I wasn't even sure if I completely believed in hell at that, up until a few years ago. But it's just always in the back of your mind. What if it was real? What if it's actually, what my parents said it was? So I think letting go of some of those old beliefs, the rapture, how terrible it's going to be, preparing for that hell. I think once the fear is gone, you're just really free to experience just the love. And it's like, oh, okay, we don't have to be afraid all the time.
And it definitely shifts your own thinking, because for me, I had written myself out of this story where I believed that as my worldview was expanding, God's love for people in my worldview was expanding as well. But it still didn't quite incorporate me. I still had my own self-doubts, and those continued with me for a long time. But my faith certainly was evolving. Another shift for me was when our brother Josiah went missing, and we thought that he was dead. I mean, as a family, we gathered and we were in mourning. That's what it felt like. We hadn't heard from him for a week. We knew the circumstances, the addiction, the homelessness, the things that were holding him back from having a life of his own. And when he went missing and the communication stopped, I thought he was dead. That's what I thought. And, we prayed so hard. We gathered as a family. And in those moments, it was rather than believing God was punishing us anymore, I started to realize that God is walking alongside us through this journey. And as hard and as scary as it was, God was accompanying us. And so when we got that hope, when we got back to the Twin Cities after Thanksgiving, and we renewed our search for him, and we got those pieces of hope where these people said, hey, we think we saw him, and we put up those posters and things, and we were getting these bits of information. Suddenly it was it was invigorating. It renewed us. It renewed our hope. And so when God brought Josiah back to us, to me it was just a perfect example that God loves Josiah, and therefore my worldview was expanded even more. So another shift for me was when my husband Justin was in the hospital. And I remember calling you. You were the first person I called, and I was just really, I was a mess. I think you probably remember, because it was so unexpected, and for him to be in that ER bed and to be so ill, I just, I didn't know what to do. And of course, family surrounding me with love and care, that was what really brought us through. And then, when Kaylin, our older sister, who's always there for everybody, she was there for us during that surgery. And that first night was touch and go. I remember how they had to use a max dose of blood pressure medication to just keep his blood pressure elevated enough to stay alive. And it was really, really scary. But what I realized from that was that God loved Justin too. And if God could love Justin, then that means that God could love me as well.
I know how I want to love my children and how I want them to love God. That allows me to really experience Him almost through their eyes. Going without being at a church for a while because we were doing this searching and trying to figure out where we wanted to start out kind of fresh and new. It really allowed our kids to have this just very sweet, loving relationship with God completely on their own. It wasn't until even a few years ago that I was really able to separate politics from religion and just decide for myself that God loves gay people, and He loves straight people, and He loves people of color, and He loves people who are of other religions. And I feel like we all are worshiping the same God, and we all want the same thing, which is, to love God and to love each other.
I wish I could say that this shift for me happened many years ago, because it would have alleviated a lot of worry and stress and anxiety. But there were always these moments of self-doubt that carried with me all the way up until I actually came to Prince of Peace. And to me, that's really the cool part of this story, is that when I heard the sermon series, Trust the Story, and when Pastor Paul Dean got into that series and started to describe all of these characters that I knew about the characters, I knew about the stories, but what I had never been taught was God's love in these stories and how He was working with these partners. I never imagined that for myself. I never imagined I could partner with God. I didn't see myself in the story. I didn't trust the story. And so for me, I had a really bad bout of kidney stones last fall, and I was in incredible pain and suffering for a week or two. And during that period of time, I think I finally got rid of the angry God in my life, because I was angry too. I was frustrated. It had disrupted my work schedule. It had disrupted my sleep schedule. It had really just been a pain overall, literally and figuratively. And I remember at one point when I was so fed up with the pain, I was mad at God and I was challenging God, and it was really kind of this back and forth in my mind of, why are you doing this? And what I realized in that moment is that I hadn't been trusting the story. I never invited God to walk alongside me. I never asked God to help alleviate my suffering. Instead, I was so fixated on the God from the past, this angry God, that that's where my mind went. And so it really took me delving deeply into trusting the story and believing that these things all happened for different reasons. I can't explain all of them, but at the end of the day, God had never failed me. God had walked beside me through my childhood. God had walked beside me when my brother Josiah was missing. God had walked beside me when Justin had his surgery. And even now in my own pain and suffering, God was there. And when I finally felt that presence of God there, it was like something I can't even describe, literally, because it was just this overwhelming sense of peace and serenity and calm. And I remember I was standing in the shower when this happened, and it was helping with the pain, but I was connecting all these pieces in my life and how they sort of created the story of me as a person. And when I got to that point where I felt like, okay, I have to trust the story. I'm part of the story. And again, just this overwhelming sense of calm and peace. And at that point, it was like every single doubt had been erased. And I haven't gone back since then. I haven't doubted again that I, as a gay man can not only be part of this great community of Prince of Peace, but I'm part of God's story, and I'm loved by God and called by God. And that was something I never experienced up until this point.